At exactly 6:30 on a quiet Saturday morning, my phone exploded with a ringtone loud enough to make me think the world had ended. I fumbled across the kitchen table, knocking over a spoon before grabbing the phone. The screen flashed one name I usually avoided before noon: my older sister, Melissa. I answered with one eye still closed. "What happened?" She didn't even say hello. "Dad died last night," she cried dramatically. "You get nothing." Then she hung up. I stared at the phone for several long seconds. Nothing. No explanation. No second call. No text. Just silence. Slowly, I turned around. My father was standing 3 feet behind me wearing plaid pajamas, holding a coffee mug in one hand and a slice of buttered toast in the other. He raised an eyebrow. "Morning." I blinked twice. "Dad?" "Yes? You, what?" "I've got some confusing news." He took another bite of toast. "If it's another bill, throw it away." "No." "Worse? I think you're dead." He stopped chewing. "I'm what?" "My sister just called." "And?" "She said you died last night." He looked down at himself. He wiggled his fingers, touched his face, poked his stomach. "Huh? What?" I expected being dead would hurt less. I couldn't help laughing. Dad shrugged. "If I'm officially dead, does that mean I don't have to mow the lawn anymore? I don't think that's how death works. That's disappointing." He sat down across from me as calmly as if we were discussing grocery shopping instead of his apparent passing. "So according to your sister, I'm dead." "Very dead." "And you've inherited nothing." "Exactly." He sipped his coffee. "That's impressive considering I haven't even finished breakfast." I checked my phone again. 27 missed calls. 9 unread text messages. 3 voicemails. The family group chat had completely exploded. "Aunt Linda, rest in peace, Harold." "Uncle Steve, gone too soon." "Cousin Brian, who gets the fishing boat?" Dad nearly sprayed coffee across the table. "I'm not even cold yet." More messages appeared. "Melissa, meeting at Dad's house at 10. Melissa, we need to discuss the estate." "Melissa, I already contacted a lawyer." Dad slowly lowered his mug. "A lawyer?" "Apparently." "For what estate?" "You own a 20-year old pickup truck, a recliner with duct tape on one arm, and approximately 67 fishing lures." He nodded proudly. 72. "You counted?" "Every Christmas." I rubbed my forehead. This can't be real. Dad suddenly smiled. "You know what?" "What?" "Don't tell anyone." "What?" "Let's see how crazy they get." "You want to pretend to be dead?" I've always wondered which relatives actually like me. Most people don't fake their own death to answer that question. Maybe they should. Before I could argue, the front yard began filling with cars. Dad peeked through the blinds. "Oh wow. Already?" Our aunt parked sideways across the driveway. Uncle Steve arrived pulling a trailer. "A trailer?" I asked. Dad squinted. "I think he's planning to steal my barbecue." Another SUV arrived. Melissa climbed out dressed entirely in black despite the temperature already pushing 80 degrees. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a stack of folders under one arm. Dad stared. "Is she carrying paperwork?" "I think so." She organized my death before checking if I was actually dead. A delivery truck stopped in front of the house. The driver unloaded 3 enormous flower arrangements. Dad sighed. "I've never received flowers while alive." One arrangement read, "Beloved Father, forever in our hearts." Dad frowned. They spelled my middle name wrong. I couldn't stop laughing. He looked almost offended. "If you're going to kill me, at least spell my name correctly." My phone rang again. "Melissa." I answered on speaker. "Where are you?" she demanded. "I'm having breakfast." "You should already be grieving." "I've only had 1 cup of coffee." "This isn't funny." "No. We have to divide everything before people start making claims. Dad's eyes widened. Divide everything? I muted the phone. She's speedrunning inheritance. Dad whispered loudly enough that Melissa almost heard him. Ask if I can keep my slippers. I nearly choked trying not to laugh. Melissa kept talking. The lawyer says we have to move quickly. What lawyer? The hospital already confirmed Dad passed. Dad frowned. Did they actually? Melissa continued. I'll explain later. Just get over here. She hung up. Dad and I exchanged another look. Something wasn't adding up. The hospital confirmed it? I asked. Dad scratched his chin. I wasn't at any hospital. Unless dead people forget where they died. I do forget things occasionally, but I think I'd remember that. We decided the only logical thing to do was drive to the hospital ourselves. Dad insisted on changing clothes first. If I'm visiting the place where I supposedly died, he said, I'd like to wear decent pants. On the way, we stopped at the neighborhood cafe, mostly because Dad refused to investigate his own death without cinnamon rolls. The bell above the cafe door jingled. Emma looked up from behind the counter. She owned the place and somehow managed to smile every single morning before sunrise. I was wondering when you'd finally show up, she teased. Dad leaned toward me. I like her already. Emma placed 2 fresh coffees on the counter. You both look confused. Dad answered before I could. My daughter says I died. Emma blinked. I'm sorry, what? I'm apparently deceased. She stared at him for a full 5 seconds. Then she burst into uncontrollable laughter. She laughed so hard she had to grab the espresso machine for balance. One tray nearly slipped from her hands. I am sorry, she gasped between laughs. You're standing right here. I noticed. Dad grinned. That's what I told my son. Emma wiped tears from her eyes. I've served a lot of strange customers, but you're officially my first ghost. Dad leaned closer to her. If ghosts still pay for coffee, I'm haunting this place forever. She laughed again, and I couldn't help smiling with her. Dad watched us carefully before casually whispering just loud enough for me to hear. I'd rather you inherit the cafe owner than my old pickup. I rolled my eyes while Emma pretended not to hear, though the blush on her face suggested she heard every single word. Just then my phone buzzed again. The hospital was finally returning my earlier call. The receptionist sounded confused. Sir, there may have been a misunderstanding involving 2 patients with the exact same name. Dad slowly smiled. I had a feeling this funeral wasn't for me. The receptionist apologized so many times that I finally felt bad for her. She explained that 2 elderly men with the exact same first and last name had been admitted overnight. One had sadly passed away. The other, my father, had never even been a patient. Dad folded his arms with a satisfied grin. So I survived another day. The receptionist looked embarrassed. I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding. Dad chuckled. Don't worry. Apparently my family has already buried me. On the drive home neither of us said much. Then Dad suddenly looked out the passenger window and smiled like a mischievous 12-year-old. We're not telling them. I nearly slammed on the brakes. What? They've already decided I'm dead. Dad, I've spent 40 years wondering what this family really thinks about me. This isn't exactly the normal way to find out. He shrugged. I'm retired. I need hobbies. By the time we reached the house, the driveway looked like a supermarket parking lot during a holiday sale. Cars lined both sides of the street. People I'd only seen at weddings and funerals were already carrying boxes. Dad slowly lowered himself in the passenger seat. They're faster than vultures. We quietly entered through the back door. Dad immediately hid behind the living room curtains where he had a perfect view of everyone. I've always wanted front row seats to family drama. The show began almost instantly. My Aunt Linda walked straight into the living room and pointed at Dad's favorite recliner. I've always admired this chair. Uncle Steve nodded. Take it. I'm getting the truck. The truck? Aunt Linda snapped. You already have 2 trucks. Exactly. A third one would complete the collection. My cousin Brian wandered into the garage carrying Dad's tackle box. I'll just hold on to these fishing lures, Dad whispered from behind the curtain. He's stealing 72 tiny pieces of plastic. I struggled not to laugh. Dad pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. You brought a notebook? I'm scoring everyone. You planned this? I planned breakfast. The notebook is for entertainment. He wrote something. What did you write? Brian. Greed level, 8 out of 10. A few minutes later, Melissa entered carrying several folders and a clipboard. She looked completely confident. Everyone, she announced dramatically. We need to stay organized. Dad leaned closer to the curtain. She's running my death like a business meeting. Melissa placed papers across the dining table. I've already contacted an attorney. Uncle Steve raised his hand. When do we discuss the property? Dad made another note. Greed level 9. Aunt Linda cleared her throat. I think Harold promised me his antique wall clock. Dad whispered to me. I absolutely did not. Melissa nodded. We'll make a list. Then she looked around. Where's my brother? I stepped into the room pretending to have just arrived. I'm here. She walked over immediately. I hope you're not planning to contest the inheritance. Inheritance? You heard me this morning. I also heard Dad was dead. He is. I glanced toward the curtains where Dad was silently eating popcorn he'd somehow found in the pantry. I had absolutely no idea where the popcorn came from. Melissa continued talking. The lawyer says everything has to move quickly. What exactly are we inheriting? The house. Dad nearly choked on popcorn. The savings. Dad quietly whispered. What savings? The truck. Dad looked offended. They're fighting over a truck with 200,000 miles? Melissa crossed her arms. Don't play innocent. I wasn't planning to. She sighed dramatically and walked away to continue organizing my father's imaginary fortune. Dad scribbled another note. Melissa. Greed level 11. I couldn't help laughing. While everyone argued inside the house, I slipped out the back door for some fresh air. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. I figured I'd find you hiding. Emma stood on the porch carrying a paper bag from the cafe. I brought lunch. You didn't have to. I know. She smiled. But your family's impossible to ignore. Half the town thinks your father is dead. Technically, only half of them are wrong. She laughed before handing me a warm sandwich. So, how's your ghost? Watching everyone steal his belongings. Her eyes widened. Seriously? I nodded. He brought popcorn. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her coffee. I knew your dad was unusual. You haven't seen anything yet. We sat together on the porch steps. For the first time all morning everything felt peaceful. She bumped my shoulder playfully. You know. What? Most people introduce me to their parents before pretending they're dead. I'll remember that next time. She smiled. I'd appreciate it. There was a brief silence. Comfortable. Easy. She looked at me with those warm brown eyes that somehow always made me forget what I was about to say. I've been meaning to ask you something. Okay. When all this insanity is over. She hesitated. Would you maybe like to have dinner? Before I could answer, the back door suddenly opened. Dad stepped outside carrying the empty popcorn bowl. He looked from Emma to me. Then back again. He grinned so widely I immediately knew what was coming. I knew it. Dad? Nope. He pointed at Emma. I like her. Emma laughed nervously. Thank you? Dad nodded. My son overthinks everything. Dad? He needs someone smarter than him. Emma covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. I can believe that. See? Dad said proudly. You've already got chemistry. I buried my face in my hands. Dad, you're supposed to be dead. Oh. He looked around dramatically. Right. He slowly tiptoed back inside the house. Just before closing the door, he whispered loudly, "Dead people approve of this relationship." Emma laughed until tears formed in her eyes. I had never seen anyone enjoy my father's ridiculous sense of humor so naturally. Inside, another loud argument erupted. Someone was apparently measuring the living room for new furniture. Dad peeked through the curtains once again, notebook in hand. Without looking away from the chaos, he calmly announced, "They've scheduled my funeral for tomorrow morning." I stared at him. "They actually did?" He smiled, closed his notebook, and reached for another handful of popcorn. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The next morning, the church parking lot was overflowing before the service even began. Cars filled every available space, and several people had parked along the road. Apparently my father was far more popular dead than he had ever been alive. Dad adjusted the baseball cap and sunglasses he was wearing. "Do I look mysterious?" "You look like a retired fisherman avoiding child support." "Perfect." His plan was unbelievably simple. He wanted to attend his own funeral without anyone recognizing him. I still couldn't believe I had agreed to this. Emma met us outside the church carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured ghosts still needed caffeine." Dad accepted one with a grateful smile. "I knew I liked this woman." Emma laughed. "I've never had a customer attend his own funeral before. It's on my retirement bucket list." She looked at me. "Your dad worries me." "He worries everyone." Dad took another sip. "I heard that." We quietly slipped into the back row just as the organ music began. The chapel looked surprisingly elegant. White flowers surrounded a polished wooden casket at the front. Only one problem. It wasn't supposed to contain my father. The hospital's paperwork hadn't reached the funeral home in time. Everyone still believed the man inside was Harold Thompson, my father. In reality, it was our elderly neighbor, who unfortunately shared exactly the same first and last name. Neither family had discovered the mistake yet. Dad leaned toward me. "This is awkward. We're just getting started." Melissa stood near the front greeting relatives with dramatic hugs. Every few seconds she sighed loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "I still can't believe Dad is gone," Dad whispered behind me. "Neither can I." I elbowed him. "Behave." "I'm trying." The minister welcomed everyone before inviting family members to share memories. Aunt Linda hurried toward the podium first. She wiped away imaginary tears. "Harold was like a brother to me." Dad quietly snorted. "You borrowed my ladder 9 years ago and never returned it." Emma bit her lip to stop herself from laughing. Aunt Linda continued. "He always said I should have his beautiful grandfather clock." Dad nearly choked on his coffee. "I absolutely never said that." He scribbled another note inside his little notebook. "Fake crying 8 points." Then Uncle Steve approached the microphone. He sighed dramatically. "My dear friend promised me his pickup truck," Dad whispered. "I promise you directions to the dealership." Another note. "Truck thief, 10 points." The speeches somehow became worse. One cousin claimed Dad had inspired him to become an entrepreneur. Dad frowned. "He sells fake concert tickets." Another relative claimed Dad loved lending money. Dad blinked. "I once loaned him $20. Did he repay it?" "He's giving the speech instead." Even Emma couldn't keep a straight face anymore. She leaned against my shoulder while trying not to laugh. Dad noticed immediately. Without saying a word, he gave me an obvious thumbs up. I pretended not to see it. Melissa finally walked to the podium. She paused dramatically before speaking. "My father taught me the importance of family," Dad whispered. "This should be interesting." "He loved us equally." Dad coughed loudly. "Did she just say equally?" I couldn't answer because I was trying too hard not to laugh. Melissa continued. "We'll honor his memory by taking good care of everything he left behind." Dad leaned closer. "There it is. The house. The savings." "What savings?" "The truck. There it is again. And his valuable personal belongings." Dad sighed. I own lawn tools and socks. The minister nodded sympathetically. Beautiful words, Dad quietly muttered. For an auction. Suddenly the funeral director hurried inside carrying a folder. He looked nervous. Very nervous. He whispered something into the minister's ear. The minister frowned. The funeral director pointed toward the paperwork. The minister looked confused. Then both men looked at the casket. Then at Melissa. Then back at the paperwork. Dad smiled. I think reality just arrived. Before either man could explain, another family entered the chapel. None of us recognized them. An elderly woman walked directly toward the front. She looked at the photograph beside the casket. Then she froze. Who are all these people? Everyone turned. The woman looked horrified. My husband is supposed to be buried today. Silence filled the room. The funeral director slowly removed the photograph from the easel. He stared at it. Then at the paperwork. Then at the woman. His face turned completely white. Oh no. A minute later the hospital administrator rushed inside, breathing heavily. I'm terribly sorry. Nobody spoke. The deceased gentleman is Harold Thompson. Melissa nodded through tears. Yes. The administrator shook his head. No. He pointed toward the elderly woman. Her husband was Harold Thompson. Then he turned toward our family. Your father is alive. The room became so quiet that someone dropping a pen sounded like an explosion. Melissa blinked. What? Your father was never admitted to our hospital. People looked around in complete confusion. One cousin whispered. Then, whose funeral is this? The elderly woman raised one hand. My husband's. Before anyone could process what had happened, the chapel doors slowly opened. Dad removed his sunglasses, straightened his jacket, walked confidently down the center aisle carrying a white box. Sorry I'm late. Every head turned toward him. I stopped for donuts. Complete silence. Absolute disbelief. One cousin screamed. He's back! Another relative stumbled backward over a chair. Aunt Linda grabbed Uncle Steve's arm. The ghost! Dad looked around innocently. If I were a ghost, would I bring glazed or chocolate? Nobody answered. Melissa looked like she'd forgotten how breathing worked. Dad? He smiled. Last time I checked. Uncle Steve pointed with trembling hands. We're at your funeral. Dad nodded. I noticed. He opened the donut box. Anyone hungry? Even the minister couldn't hide a smile. The tension finally broke when Emma burst into laughter. I followed. Then Dad. A few seconds later, half the chapel was laughing while the other half stood frozen in disbelief. The elderly neighbor's family started laughing too after the administrator explained the entire misunderstanding and sincerely apologized. Dad walked over to the elderly widow. I'm so sorry this happened. She smiled warmly. My Harold would have thought this was hilarious. Dad gently hugged her. I hope we can give your husband the respectful service he deserves. She nodded gratefully. As everyone began helping rearrange the chapel for the correct family, Emma quietly slipped her hand into mine. Neither of us said anything. Dad noticed from across the room. He smiled to himself. Then he wrote one final sentence in his little notebook before closing it. Best funeral I've ever attended. By late afternoon, the entire town had heard the story. Some people called it the biggest funeral mix-up in decades. Others simply called it the day Harold came back from the dead carrying donuts. Dad preferred that version. It has a better ending, he said as we drove home. When we pulled into the driveway, the same relatives who had been arguing over furniture the day before were suddenly acting like the world's happiest family. Nobody mentioned the truck anymore. Nobody mentioned the house. Nobody mentioned the mysterious savings account that had apparently existed only in their imaginations. Dad unlocked the front door and walked inside like a victorious general returning from battle. He clapped his hands once. Living room. Nobody moved. I said living room. 5 minutes later everyone sat quietly, avoiding eye contact. Dad stood in front of the fireplace holding the little notebook that had become famous over the past 2 days. Melissa stared at it nervously. What's that? My observations. Uncle Steve swallowed. You took notes? For educational purposes. Dad put on his reading glasses. I'd like to begin tonight's awards ceremony. Everyone looked confused. Emma sat beside me on the couch, already trying not to laugh. Dad cleared his throat. Our first award. He looked dramatically around the room. Fastest inheritance claim. Melissa slowly lowered her head. The winner is... He smiled. My daughter. Emma snorted into her coffee. Dad continued. Time between hearing I was supposedly dead and contacting a lawyer. He checked the notebook. 26 minutes. The room burst into laughter. Even Melissa couldn't hide an embarrassed smile. Dad raised one finger. That's a family record. He turned another page. Next award. The Golden Vulture. Uncle Steve groaned. I don't like where this is going. Dad ignored him. This award goes to the relative who claimed my pickup truck before my body was cold. Everyone looked at Uncle Steve. He sighed. Fair enough. Dad handed him an old toy trophy shaped like a chicken. I found this in the garage. The entire room laughed. Aunt Linda shook her head. I suppose I'm next. You certainly are. Dad smiled. The Antique Clock Appreciation Award. She covered her face with both hands. I deserve that. You absolutely did. Then Dad looked toward Cousin Brian. The Master Fisherman Award. Brian laughed nervously. For what? For attempting to steal 72 fishing lures. I wasn't stealing. You loaded them into your truck. I was protecting them. From me? The room erupted again. For nearly 20 minutes Dad read one ridiculous award after another. Best fake crying. Most dramatic sigh. Fastest furniture measurement. Most creative story about Dad's final wishes. Even the minister received an honorary certificate for accidentally conducting a funeral with the wrong audience. By the end everyone was laughing so hard tears filled their eyes. Finally Dad closed the notebook. His smile softened. I've joked enough. The room became quiet. I've spent my whole life believing family should be worth more than things. Nobody interrupted him. When Melissa called yesterday morning, he looked at her kindly. I wasn't hurt because you thought I died. He paused. I was hurt because nobody stopped to make sure it was true. Melissa stared at the floor. I know. I heard people dividing my belongings before anyone talked about memories. Silence filled the room again. Melissa slowly stood. She walked toward Dad. I'm sorry. Her voice shook. I heard the hospital say your name. I panicked. I never asked another question. I never confirmed anything. I just assumed. She wiped away real tears this time. And then, I made everything worse. Dad opened his arms. She hugged him tightly. I forgive you. She cried against his shoulder. I promise I'll apologize to our neighbor's family tomorrow. Dad nodded. They deserve that. They lost someone they loved. And we accidentally turned their funeral into a comedy show. Melissa laughed through her tears. I still can't believe you walked in carrying donuts. Dad looked confused. What? I was hungry. Even Melissa laughed harder. The tension that had hung over everyone for 2 days finally disappeared. Dad looked around the room one last time. I have one final announcement. Everyone immediately became serious again. There is no secret fortune. Several cousins looked disappointed. The house still has a leaking roof. The truck barely starts. My savings account isn't impressive. He smiled warmly. But I'm richer than I realized. He looked around at everyone gathered together. I've got children. I've got friends. I've got neighbors. And apparently I've got enough relatives to fill an entire church. He chuckled. I guess that's worth something. That evening Emma helped me wash dishes after everyone else drifted outside. Neither of us spoke for a while. The quiet felt comfortable. She finally smiled. So, your father survived his own funeral. He did. And your family survived being exposed. Barely. She laughed. I think today qualifies as the strangest day of my life. I hope tomorrow is less exciting. She gently nudged my shoulder. I don't know. I've kind of enjoyed surviving your family's chaos. I looked at her. Really? She nodded. I have. I took a deep breath. I've wanted to ask you something for a long time. She waited patiently. When this whole story becomes old news, would you have dinner with me? She smiled before I even finished speaking. I thought you'd never ask. She stepped closer. I've liked you for years. I was beginning to think your dad would have to fake another funeral before you noticed me. I laughed. I deserve that. She reached for my hand. I'd love to. Without thinking, I leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle. Simple. Perfect. A loud cough suddenly echoed behind us. We jumped apart. Dad stood in the kitchen doorway holding his coffee mug. He looked completely unsurprised. I knew it. I groaned. Dad, I only came back because I forgot my wallet. He looked at Emma and smiled. Welcome to the family. Emma laughed. I don't think I've officially agreed to that yet. Dad winked. You will. Then he picked up his mug and started toward the living room. Halfway there he stopped and looked back one last time. Oh. If anyone calls tomorrow morning saying I died again. He pointed toward the refrigerator. Make sure somebody saves me a donut this time. The entire house exploded with laughter, and for the first time in years, it wasn't money, property, or inheritance that brought the family together. It was one unbelievable mistake, one impossible funeral, and one very stubborn man who refused to let anyone bury him before breakfast.